So I was online this afternoon and I saw a funny political sticker. It said, I used to be liberal, and then I moved out of my parents' house and I got a job. And I laughed. I would have laughed, the same way when I was 15 at that sticker. And it dawned on me that we don't really see a whole lot of humor in politics anymore. A lot of it has become bitter. And part of that is just the quality of the politicians. Hillary Clinton did not have really a sense of humor. Elizabeth Warren does not have a sense of humor. You say the same thing about politicians all over the world. They don't seem to have a sense of humor. And why is that important? Well, it's important because politics, if you're really in a position where you have, as an individual, some degree of power or autonomy, you're going to be able to be under a political system that allows you to mock the deficiencies of whoever is ruling over you, whoever has more power than you do. And to the extent that you can't mock people in power, it tells you something about the disconnect between yourself as the individual and the system that you're living under, vis-a-vis people in power. And by the way, it's not just the Democratic, quote-unquote, liberal party issue. When I was growing up, Ronald Reagan did have a sense of humor. That's probably why he was so successful, despite not having as much substance as Jimmy Carter, or even, let's say, Nixon, who was a lawyer and not an actor. But I have to say that Jimmy Carter's lack of humor, when he actually did have a sense of humor, it's just more subtle. He likes Willie Nelson and so on and so forth. But whatever he lacked in terms of humor, he made up for in terms of sincerity. And that was really Jimmy Carter, we're going back about 40 years now, has been the last American politician you could put the label of sincere to. So it's not necessarily a quote-unquote conservative or liberal issue. It's not only a nationwide issue in the U.S., it's a worldwide issue. And you look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump used to have a sense of humor, but I think he's been so attacked online and in other ways that he probably lost it over time. And unfortunately, that dynamic is something that is indicative of a failing system. As of today, I'm not at all that interested in the American political system. It's clearly failing. And when something fails, you start to look for reasons, if you are sincere and you care about the world you live in, you try to look for reasons why it failed so you don't make the same mistakes. And the reason that a sense of humor, it should be something that you honor and cherish, is because, in part, when you're growing up, the political system, well, who do you look up to? You've got sports models, you've got role models all over all in different areas. You've got engineers, you've got corporate titans, and you used to have politicians. And the reason you used to listen to politicians is because presumably before the advent of private security and private sector surveillance, for the most part, only a politician would be in a position where they would be able to tell you or give you a viewpoint that was as close as possible to a neutral viewpoint based on the widest number of sources. One of the reasons that they could do that is because they had access to this idea that they were objective and they were looking out for everyone in their country. Whereas, theoretically, a private sector businessman or businesswoman would be mainly concerned about private sector competition and his or her own employees. Now, as the world has become more global, those lines between the private sector and the public sector have all but disappeared. And that is not new. How did we have, I'm here in Singapore, and they speak English. English is the official language now here. Why? This country was occupied by the British. The founder of the PAP, the prevailing party here, hated the British. Didn't like the Japanese occupiers that much either, but did not like the British at all. And this is despite the fact that he was educated, LKY, in London as a lawyer. And so, you look around and you start to realize that the reason that we're speaking English here is because you have the British East India Company, you have the Dutch, all of these essentially massive multinational entities were trading in ways that extended a global influence. That's not altogether different from what's happening now. In some cases, like in Bengal, as we learn more and more in India, as we learn more and more about history, we're starting to realize that in many cases that the occupation was one of the worst things that ever happened in human history. And when you peel back all the layers of what made it happen, of what made that kind of injustice happen, a lot of it is racism. But you also had a situation where these these multinational entities that were connected to the government or the king or the queen were in a position where they were collecting taxes and fees on behalf of the British government. So they were functioning as a quasi-governmental entity, despite shareholder status and so on and so forth, and all the other hallmarks of a private corporation. So it really, if you look at history as not necessarily something linear, but as a sort of fluctuating system, where we try a new system, it fails, we don't know where to go with that, so we end up reverting to the old ways. That might be a better way to look at history. And what you see now is people have essentially tried to divorce themselves from that non-linear timeline by trying to bypass, for example, the existing financial system that is backed by these corporations and governmental entities through the blockchain. And that's one of the reasons why this sort of technology has been given a lot of publicity all over the world today, because it represents, or is supposed to represent, another path away from this failed, non-linear timeline of human history. Unfortunately, for many reasons, this technology seems to represent yet another failure to divorce ourselves from our failed methods of peaceful coexistence and the sanctity of the individual. But it's still happening. People are still believe in the technology. But as with everything else, whenever human beings are involved, history repeats itself. And what's the real strategy of the blockchain has been to remove human beings and therefore human discretion from the equation, thereby creating a superior method of moving forward, one that might have fewer mistakes, but obviously one that's going to leave a lot of people behind simply by not having the ability to program a sufficient number of choices that would make everyone, or as many people as possible, happy, or at least content. So why am I having this discussion? Why is it important? You're growing up, you want to listen to politicians as one slice of the pie of human knowledge. And in the old days, they were able to capture our attention because they had access to information that the rest of us might not have access to. For example, this is going to be before the internet. And so you start to look at this whole system, and I go back to, why is a sense of humor so important? For one thing, you have to look at Singapore. I want to contrast the American political system with the Singaporean model. This country has the most successful, or has had the most successful political system in the 21st century. There's no doubt about that. No one else even comes close. And by way of example, I'm now in essentially a ghetto. I'm in the poorest part of Singapore. This is the ghetto. And yet, and in fact, the government knows this is a de facto ghetto. It's building. It received, these look like public housing, but it's very common in Singapore. It's actually a very common system in a lot of quote-unquote communist countries with the block housing. It just happens to look a lot nicer than the ones you might see in the old Soviet Union. And this is, of course, subsidized by the government. I think the mortgage interest rates out here, fluctuate anywhere between 2 and 3.5%, maybe even less, depending on where interest rates are. And so again, there are no homeless people here. There's not a whole lot to see or do, but I can walk out in the middle of the day. There's a grocery store over here, and this place, I think the PAP in Singapore, which has been the prevailing party since the founding of the country, only in this neighborhood only received about 54% of the vote. So again, we're noticing a lot of construction because people are trying to create a system where this place becomes something more than what it is now. But what does this have to do with a sense of humor? Well, I've been trying to find good Singaporean movies and good Singaporean authors. And by the way, it's also diverse because each of these housing estates or flats, again, that's British, right? The word flat comes from the UK. Each of these is required by law, I'm going to move away from the construction, to have a minimum level of diversity, essentially a racial quota. Again, this is how things were done in the old days when it was easy. You didn't have as much, mixing. Things were a bit more simple. And now those minimum, quotas are, what do you replace it with in order to maintain diversity? How do you do that as more and more people mix? And so there has to be a new way of doing things, and nobody really knows how to do that, as the old lines are starting to blur and create new pathways on this non-linear timeline. And the fact of the matter is, I can't find one good Singaporean movie. There's a show that's kind of cute. It's called I Not Stupid. It's a series. It's sort of a quasi-comedy. Okay, it's not bad. It's just not something I would watch again. And I think it's a bit odd that would be the best thing I've seen from Singapore. Now you contrast that with Hong Kong, another place that was colonized by the British, given back to China, I believe, 1999? I don't remember exactly when. But it's a complete contrast. And in fact, one of the reasons Singapore became so successful is because the British, instead of focusing on Singapore, post the partition between Malaya and the Straits Settlements, which is what Singapore used to be called. Before that partition, the British were hoping to keep Malaysia and Singapore as one entity. That didn't work out. You had the Indonesians forcefully protesting, and as a result, I believe, the British focused on Hong Kong and therefore brought a stronger financial system into Hong Kong, which of course produced so much culture, so many incredible things, and not just action, almost everything. You can't even come up with a list. So, because the number of movies you would have to put on that list from Hong Kong would be enormous. So you have two countries or two entities, very similar history, totally different outcomes culturally. And part of that, again, has to do with the political systems. Now, people are saying that Hong Kong today is less stable than Singapore. And they might be right. The kind of protests that you see in Hong Kong would never happen in Singapore, in part because of the way the government strictly regulates protests and marches. It's a permit. You can only have a quote-unquote public protest in a designated area called Hong Lim Park. I've been there. It's a beautiful park. Very, very big, relatively speaking. Got some nice history to it. But the fact of the matter is, you're never going to see, say, transit workers clogging up the streets here based on the political system in Singapore. And yet, something feels missing here. And the complaint has always been that Singapore lacks a soul. It's a corporate machine that has managed to perfectly weld the corporate and the governmental together in ways that have produced prosperity for almost everyone, especially everyone Singaporean. And yet something feels missing. And I say that as somebody who studied here about 20 years ago. When I came here 20 years ago, I felt a completely different energy. And by the way, here's one sign of being in a quote-unquote ghetto. You'll see that there's some sort of the colors behind me on the wall. So you notice black. But even despite all that, this is that's the worst thing I can say about this neighborhood, other than it's really dull. About a mile away is public transportation. It takes about an hour to get to the city center. I play chess. I try to play chess once a week with a club. By the time I get off the bus and the train to get there and back, the whole thing takes about an hour and a half. Sometimes on the way back, if I come late, it takes about 2 hours to get back. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to remember that this country is so small that you can drive across the whole country in a matter of hours if you had a straight line from one end to the other. You don't. And yet, despite this being a poor area to live, you still have public transportation, within walking distance. And so there's no doubt that the political system here works. And yet, compared to when I was here 20 years ago, when this was considered to be a quote-unquote developing country, something feels missing. And the question is, why? What is that? And I was in Hong Kong, I believe, and it was as vibrant around the similar times. And it was vibrant. I mean, I probably should go back now or at some point in the future just to see what it's like, to make comparisons. But I did go after the handover to China, and again, it's one of the nicest places in the world. It was a similar system in terms of transportation and so on and so forth, but there was a vibrancy there that no longer exists in Singapore. And my contention is that this is why not only a sense of humor is important, but why politicians are important. And we have to study Singapore to figure out how to move forward. Because in the United States, you've got this tripartite system of essentially what's supposed to be lawyers, judges, police, military, and then legislators, all work cooperating but being slightly adversarial in order to create a more perfect system of government. But what's happened, especially now, is that you've got lawyers in the executive branch, and that's different from before. In many countries today, whether it's Thailand or it really just doesn't, or a lot of other places, the military still runs the country. And you can argue that everywhere you've gone post-World War II, the military has run the country. And the civilians have only been, whether they're lawyers or someone else, some other profession, they've only really been a show, a cover, a front for expansive military spending. And that's true whether you're in Singapore or the United States. Healthcare, because of an aging population, has caused a lot of money to be spent in Singapore on healthcare, but the military is either number one or number two in spending. So it doesn't matter if you are a successful political system or an unsuccessful one like in the United States, you're still spending most of your budget plus appropriations on the military. Or at least, I shouldn't say most. Let me rephrase that. In terms of if you create a pie chart of spending, total spending, off budget and on budget, the total amount of spending in terms of being the number one slice of the pie, the largest slice of the pie, would be the military in most successful quote-unquote countries. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's not necessarily safety, but the fact that you can't run without oil post-World War II. And one of the reasons Germany was so successful is they immediately ran over Austria, which unfortunately welcomed Hitler, who was actually Austrian, not German. They openly welcomed Adolf Hitler, and Austria has oil. It's the headquarters of OPEC today, if I'm not mistaken. So that's one of the once the Germany was able to take over the oil, it was able to run over everyone else. And again, the United States, you can easily understand, the presence of the United States in the Middle East and the alliance with Saudi Arabia. And so you had to have military spending because the entire system, everything you do, whether it's a plastic bag, really just car, it's all been based on this global trade of natural resources that requires a strong navy and then support systems around that navy, around that transport of goods. And in fact, if you look at what is most traded, it's oil and then coffee worldwide. I think someone here, there are all these different ghost festivals or Hantu festivals in Singapore. So one thing you see is a lot of people burning offerings or giving offerings to their ancestors. And that's if you go to any Asian country, you'll probably see some of this happening. You'll see the fruits at the bottom. And I believe that's a Buddhist ceremony. So you go back to the sense of humor, you go back to the fact that despite being one of the most successful countries in the world, where I am now, only about half the people are voting for the prevailing party, which has been the most successful political party in the world for the last 20 years. So something is wrong, something is broken. And it goes back to how bitter the political discourse has become. And the question is, we have to fix that. Because if you're not able to laugh at that bumper sticker that I mentioned, you can't really sit down and break bread or have a meal with anyone. It's not something that's possible unless you do have a sense of humor. And here, of course, there's a situation where even if you have a successful political system with an opposition that's fairly reasonable, something still feels missing. And how do you move forward from these competing issues between the stability that comes from not necessarily censoring, but reducing available speakers or the full panoply with a full discourse possible. You have stability that's based on a reduction that maintains stability, especially of the political parties in power. And then you have this other system that allows full or as much possible discourse as possible, and yet has created a fragmented society that more and more has become bitter. And yet they all have the same thing in common, which is military spending in order to secure access to natural resources. If you're in Germany right now, you're looking at, again, very high heating bills. We tried to switch from petroleum into natural gas, and then LNG, and now we're trying to shift into other sorts of resources, and all of them burn something. Even if you have a battery, you have to have lithium. Everything in the world runs on something, and whoever gains access or monopolizes the source of that something is able to create the rules around the trading of that commodity, and then have presumably a successful financial market and then a legal market around that trade of essential resources. For the lawyers, you see, they're not there to protect the poor. They're not there to protect freedom. No one really is. They're there to protect this trade in a way that allows partners to succeed and outsiders to fail. That's where alliances come in, NATO and so on and so forth. All of this has fallen apart. In the United States, again, in that last 20 years, with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, obviously the lawyers failed, financial regulation failed around the trading of those commodities. You had derivatives that were supposed to stabilize prices that went the other way. The lawyers failed, but you have to understand why they failed. And that may go back to why, anything that has human beings involved has at its base the seeds of failure. And this idea in the United States and the West that separating government into three different entities is going to make things better, I think is no longer the case. What's really happened is that separation has created so much complexity that it has caused a deeply fragmented society. But out of that fragmentation, you've had a remarkable amount of creativity because you've had more voices in that discourse. You've had the full discourse or a greater amount of discourse as opposed to one that's led purely by the executive branch. And so you're looking at China, or perhaps even Russia, now moving forward, at a different system. Now you talk about movies. China does have a lot of good singers, a lot of great culture, not just on TikTok. There's a great movie called Aftershock. It's about the earthquake that happened many years ago in China, and a brother and a sister that were separated as a result of the earthquake and then grew up apart. There was a movie right now that came out about COVID-19, about what happened in different communities around that time. I don't think it's necessarily a classic, but it does show that the Chinese model of movie making, they've essentially created a Hollywood of their own. And that's true not just in China, but in, say, Malaysia. You have Ijen Ali, very similar to Pixar. You have all these different models that are working, and yet we're still dealing with a fragmented system because no one really knows what model actually works. And that's where you see a lot of the discourse failing and becoming more and more bitter. And at least one part of the solution, in my opinion, has to be a sense of humor. If your political system lacks a sense of humor, then it better have sincerity. And I don't think we're making Jimmy Carters anymore. So at that point, you go back to a sense of humor that manifests itself through the culture. That allows people growing up to realize that though the adults are fighting, there's something that binds us together in the end. At least if we're able to laugh about something and sit down together and have a conversation.